In the Oprah interview, you accuse members of your family of racism. You don't even,
Really?
well, of...
The British press said that.
But obviously now people are very aware of my race because they made it such an issue when I went to the UK. But before that, most people didn't treat me like a black woman.
Previously in the series, we talked about how Meghan used her Americanness and her foreign background and her status as a commoner to explain away why she couldn't successfully assimilate into royalty. But today's topic is, without a doubt, the most contentious of them all: race. I suppose it's time for the boilerplate disclaimer that I have used on many occasions whenever I talk about this topic. I am not denying that racism exists. If any of you have been here long enough or have watched enough of my videos, you would know that I have been on the receiving end of such hateful, racist, nonsensical comments about the color of my skin, how curly my hair is, the brown of my eyes, a third eye on my forehead. So believe you me, I know that it hurts, but that's why I feel so strongly about it when people like Meghan hijack a legitimate cause simply to twist and turn the narrative to suit her own malevolent needs. So if you have an issue with Caucasian people talking about race and racism, then this is not the video for you. Please click out right now, lest you get, as the kids say today, triggered. Otherwise, welcome aboard. It's very clear from Meghan's own words that she has always grappled with being biracial. Whether it was on her now defunct blog, The Tig, or doing interviews, she frequently brought up anecdotes from her past about how she had to make my own box when selecting ethnicity, or how people thought her mother was the nanny. Experiences which, if true, and we all know our Megs has a flair for the dramatic, would have certainly been compounded by the fact that there were racial tensions, to say the least, while she was growing up in LA in the early 90s. And about that drawing your own box topic, you can actually still read it. It's in the archived version of her blog online. It was in this post that we come across that old story she loves to rehash about how one day in 7th grade, she had to create her own box whilst filling up the ethnicity section of the census form because she didn't fit into the categories provided, being white, black, Hispanic, or Asian. She writes, "There I was, my curly hair, my freckled face, my pale skin, my mixed race, looking down at these boxes, not wanting to mess up, but not knowing what to do. You could only choose one, but that would be to choose one parent over the other, and one half of myself over the other. My teacher told me to check the box for Caucasian, because that's how you look, Meghan," she said. I put down my pen, not as an act of defiance, but rather a symptom of my confusion. I couldn't bring myself to do that, to picture the pit in her belly sadness my mother would feel if she were to find out. So I didn't tick a box. I left my identity blank, a question mark, an absolute incomplete, much like how I felt. When I went home that night, I told my dad what had happened. He said the words that have always stayed with me. "If that happens again, you draw your own box." Touching story, if true, but there is reason to doubt its veracity. I took the liberty of looking up census forms from the early 90s in the US, and while these may not have been the exact forms that Meghan was asked to fill in school, every single form I came across had an other field to fill in if you didn't fall under any of the listed categories. So I'm not calling her a liar. I didn't go to school in the US. Heck, I wasn't born then, but it just seems strange that I couldn't find a form without an other section to fill in. Anyone from the US, please feel free to chime in. She then proceeds to talk about how her being biracial continued to be, if not an issue amongst her peers, then at least a talking point, which always made her uncomfortable until she grew up and blossomed and learned that she was enough exactly as she was. And we all lived happily ever after. Except she clearly didn't learn how to accept herself, as evidenced by her less than pleased expression when she says black woman in this clip.
Most people didn't treat me like a black woman.
Her reading insults into every little thing like that almost straight out of Compton article, or when she was offered the services of the late Queen's equerry, who just happened to be black. More on that later. Coupled with other scenarios, such as her glowing review of her daughter's
blue eyes.
One can't help but wonder, is Meghan Markle a racist herself? And is she projecting all of her deep-seated insecurities at the royal family and the UK in general? Honestly, I don't know the answer. But racist or not, based on what we've seen over these past 8 years, one thing is clear. Meghan Markle is obsessed with the topic of race. And more importantly, she is hell-bent on using it as both a weapon and a shield to attack anyone who defies her and to shield herself against any criticism, whether valid or not, that comes her way. After meeting Harry, the earliest signs of Meghan's deep-seated issues and sensitivities around race emerged in November of 2016, when the Daily Fail released that one fateful article about how one of the LA suburbs that Meghan grew up in, called Crenshaw, was allegedly a rundown area with gangs, shootouts, high levels of crime, basically making it out like it's the ghetto. Now, I've never been to Crenshaw. So again, anyone in the comments who's been, who's lived there, who currently lives there, let us know what the real situation is. But based on the research I've done, it looks like Crenshaw is just like any other suburb in any other country in the world, really. It's got the good and it's got the bad. But regardless, we all know the aftermath of this article, of course. She blew up and threatened to leave Harry if he didn't formally acknowledge their relationship and condemn the public and the press through an official palace statement. An unprecedented move that we already discussed in great detail in a video I made a few weeks ago called The Monster, and which really served to highlight just how thin-skinned and tyrannical Meghan Markle is. But as we all know now, that was just the beginning, merely a taste of what was to come. We had the now disproven lies on the Oprah interview.
So we have in tandem the conversation of he won't be given security, he's not going to be given a title, and also concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born.
The cut, where she accused either the UK in general, the royal family, or the press of calling her children the N-word, which they never did. The flopcast.
If there's any time in my life that it's been more focused on my race, it's only once I started dating my husband. Then I started to understand what it was like to be treated like a black woman.
And of course, the Netflix series, which was basically a hit piece almost entirely centered upon racism. Oh, and let's not forget the Ripple of Hope Award, where they accepted an award for standing up to said racism, which only a few months later, Harry denied even existed.
She said there were troubling comments about
there was concern about his skin colour.
Right. Wouldn't you describe that as essentially racist?
I wouldn't, not having lived within that family.
And then finally came Endgame, where the two alleged royal racists were accidentally named, and Harry and Meghan remained eerily silent, neither confirming nor denying anything. The thing is, though, we know that pretty much every single one of their allegations, accusations, have been unfounded and have instead been proven to be a toddler tantrum being thrown on the world stage by a woman in her 40s for not being made queen the moment she said, "I do." Inherent to Meghan's racism claims is this notion of her being the very first black, or at least biracial, princess in the British monarchy. Meaning the British royal family is obviously racist, right? If she's the only person of color to have married into their family in 1,000 years. And we saw this notion being backed up by, frankly, such racist commentary. I don't even know how this commentary is allowed on national television, let alone condoned, such as this one.
We've gone from the rich diversity of the Abbey to a terribly white balcony. I'm very struck by that.
We've talked about this before, but terribly white? In a country where the latest census records reveal that 81.7% of the population is white? with literally only 4% identifying as black. So now it's a terrible thing for a country's royal family, who are all, barring Meghan Markle, of European, British blood and ancestry, to represent the overwhelming majority of its constituents. Talk about racism. And they talk like Meghan Markle is actually black. I mean, people, she's been white passing her whole life. She said it herself in the clips I played earlier. Imagine someone saying that in the reverse. Imagine a white person saying that an African royal family was terribly black. I mean, the world would be on fire. But ridiculous and overtly racist statements aside, I wanted to know, is Meghan Markle truly the first biracial or black woman to marry into the British royal family? Well, assuming certain historical theories are absolutely false, yes. Yes, she is. There are two queens in British history whom some historians theorize may have been of mixed race. Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of King Edward III of England, married in 1328, and Queen Charlotte of England and Ireland, wife of King George III, who lived in the 18th century. Evidence of both of these women having either black or Moorish ancestry, and these two are not synonymous by the way, is shaky at best, derived predominantly from contemporaneous descriptions of their appearance. In Queen Philippa's case, either she or her sister, historians can't be sure, had been described as being brown of skin all over, despite paintings from the 14th century all depicting her as white. Now, there is an argument that she had been whitened up for official portraits, which apparently wasn't an unusual thing to do, even in the 14th century. She was even voted 5th in the 100 Great Black Britons list in 2003, but that choice has been criticized by historians who argued that there was virtually no evidence suggesting that the Queen had any African lineage. I do want to say, there isn't just one shade of white. You know, you can have pretty tan and Mediterranean-looking Caucasians, like myself actually. So perhaps that was the case with Queen Philippa. And the same goes for Queen Charlotte 400 years later. While she was described as having a true mulatto face, meaning very distinct African features, and had some very racist accounts of her appearance noted by her contemporaries, she was always depicted as a white woman, even in unflattering caricatures. And so, in that case as well, no solid proof exists of any African lineage. The most that could be traced back in her instance was a very distant Portuguese relative from 15 generations before her who may have been Moorish. But remember, being a Moor doesn't mean being a black African. In the Middle Ages, the term was used to denote Arabs, Berbers, and just Muslim Europeans in general. So yes, it appears that there were virtually no black royals or biracial royals specifically in Britain until Meghan Markle married Harry. And it would be easy to throw one's arms up in indignance and declare that the absence of a black or biracial British royal is inherently proof of racism. And given the history of slavery that plagues Britain to this day, it's understandable why some people might think that way. However, it doesn't make it true. Was slavery horrific? I mean, of course. It goes without saying. It is a stain on humanity. A stain that, by the way, we haven't altogether gotten rid of even to this very day. But can we truly just automatically assume slavery and racism and oppression on everything that offends us? Of course not. Otherwise, we'd be no better than Meghan Markle. The lack of diversity within royal families in general, we're focusing on European and British royal families in this instance, especially in the distant past, is most likely a result of both politics and biology. The political aspect we've already covered in part 2 of this series, being that monarchies very often intermarry to strengthen or secure alliances. Naturally, that would mean that since we're talking about Europe and England, and at a time that long predates convenient travel and globalization, members of the various royal families that ruled were white. And so white marries white, you get all white families. It's not rocket science. And then there's the biological aspect. If you look at the UK statistics on interracial relationships, you will find that in comparison to same ethnicity couples, which represent the overwhelming majority of the population, the numbers are very low. Now, you could be reductive and claim that that's racism, which would make all of us racists, I suppose, a notion that I'm sure all of us would take umbrage at, given that we all have different tastes and different preferences when it comes to what we're attracted to in another person. Or you could blame biology, specifically a phenomenon called assortative mating, which is just a fancy way of saying that people tend to be attracted to and form relationships with people who are quite similar to them in many areas, which include physical traits. Further to that, if you consider these statistics I pulled up earlier, a staggering 81.7% of the UK's population was white as of 2021. So even if assortative mating wasn't a thing, which it most definitely is, it's purely a matter of numbers. There are simply far more white people walking around the place, and so the likelihood of two white people falling in love is statistically far higher than a mixed race couple perhaps. We saw how, for instance, only 4% of the population was black in 2021. I also think it's very important to point out that yes, while slavery was allowed and existed and was abhorrent, not all British royals and aristocrats were pro-slavery. In fact, many of them were abolitionists before the trade was even abolished. For instance, Elizabeth Dido Bell, known as Britain's first black aristocrat, was the mixed-race daughter of Sir John Lindsay, a British naval officer, and an enslaved black woman called Maria Bell. She was adopted when she was very little by Lord Chief Justice William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield, who was a very prominent judge and was famously against slavery, having described it as so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. And by positive law, he meant just man-made law. It cannot be a will of God or the natural order of things. Dido was even included in Lord Mansfield's will and was left with a lump sum payment of £500 and £100 annually thereafter, which admittedly wasn't as much as her cousins, who were Lord Mansfield's actual nieces and nephews. They were blood relatives. But for the time, for the 18th century, when slavery wasn't yet abolished, everything Lord Mansfield had done for Dido was virtually unheard of. And in my books, definitely commendable. Later, in the Victorian era, a young Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who, despite being born a Yoruba princess, was later sold into slavery after being orphaned. One day, she found herself in Queen Victoria's presence in England, and the Queen, whose ascension to the throne coincided with the abolition of slavery, at least in a legal sense, was so impressed by her that she ended up taking her in as a ward and raising her as her goddaughter, inviting her to big events such as her own children's weddings. But 250 years later, we have Emma Thynne, the very first black British marchioness in history, who, much like Meghan, is of mixed race, being of Nigerian and English ancestry, and alleges that she did experience racism in aristocratic circles, including from her mother-in-law, who, it is alleged, was banned from attending her wedding after having expressed concerns over, quote, 400 years of bloodline to her son. Now, it's important to acknowledge that Lady Bath has denied these claims, including her being banned from the nuptials. It's also interesting to note that there are considerable similarities in Emma and Meghan's stories, including claims from Emma such as, before meeting her husband, she hadn't experienced any racism growing up, and that her race was never an issue until she got engaged. I wonder if this is where Meghan found inspiration for her little concerns over Archie's skin color story. It wouldn't be the first time she plagiarized something. As I said in the disclaimer, the purpose of this video is not to prove that racism doesn't exist, or everyone in Britain isn't racist, or everyone in the history of the royal family isn't racist. Of course I can't prove that, because it's not true. Racism exists everywhere humans exist. It always has, and it always will. The issue here is when someone like Meghan is hijacking and weaponizing, as I said earlier, a legitimate issue that we should all be fighting to eliminate. In the words of Rose Hulse, an African-American woman who married George Hulse, the grandson of a baronet, in 2017, the danger is that people who casually use the word racist risk diminishing the real meaning of the word and the irreparable damage it can cause. And she's absolutely right. Not every perceived slight is automatically racist or sexist or discriminatory in any other way. Sometimes, perhaps a lot of the time, it's about our behavior. And in Meghan Markle's case, it is pretty much 99.999% about that. You know, leaving a little margin of error for some actual racists out there who hate her. But in order for the likes of Meghan and Harry to understand this very vital fact, they're going to have to develop this little thing that humans have called insight. I've said this before on this channel. To truly erase racism, we have to stop seeing color and start seeing people. But this notion of not seeing color is something that Meghan Markle seems to be entirely incapable of. I mentioned earlier today, and I said we'd get back to it, that as part of the team assigned to Meghan by the Queen to help her integrate, successfully assimilate into royal life, a Ghanaian-born equerry by the name of Nana Kofi Tumasi Ankara, a lieutenant colonel in the British Army, was assigned to help her to feel comfortable in her new role. And that's after Meghan had already turned down Lady Susan Hussey, the Queen's lady-in-waiting of, more than, 60 years. Now, these equerries are hand-picked by the principals, being the monarch in this particular instance. So clearly, when the late Queen Elizabeth II hand-picked Lieutenant Colonel Tumasi Ankara, she believed he was good enough for her. But was he good enough for Meghan? Well, no. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Meghan was insulted at the Queen's choice of a black man to be her mentor, her guide. And we know this through Meghan's very own mouthpiece, Omid Scobie, who wrote in his flop of a book Endgame last year, though a charming and intelligent man, it stood out like a sore thumb to Meghan and her friends. Which really begs the question, why? Why did it stand out like a sore thumb? Was it because he was black? Would it have stood out like a sore thumb if, say, he'd been, Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Thompson? Or would Meghan have danced for joy? And why did Meghan have to make this about race? The Lieutenant Colonel was already the Queen's equerry since 2017. It's not like she plucked him from the streets right then and there because he was black, like, oh, you'll do, and, offered him to Meghan. That's what makes me wonder. I mean, is she a racist herself? And is she simply projecting her own views onto the world? Even her sudden willingness to associate herself with Africans is suspicious and points to her trying to use them for her own means. Especially for a woman who was white passing her entire life and said something like, I was never looked at as a black woman until I came to the UK, as if it was a bad thing, as if it was an insult. If she truly was 43% Nigerian, why didn't she condemn the horrific attack on Christian Nigerians during Christmas Eve last year? That was well after she posed with Nigerian athletes during the Invictus Games only 3 months prior, where she was named Amira Ngozi Lolo. Where was Amira Ngozi Lolo when she could have helped by bringing awareness to the plight of Christian Nigerians? What about the Baka tribe, who are probably still being brutalized by rangers from Prince Harry's African parks? Even the way she wheels out her mother whenever there is a black-centric event. It's not a coincidence. It's she's Meghan's token black person. See, here's proof I'm black. But, from where I'm sitting, it's not the royal family or the British public who embraced her and loved her and didn't see her color. They saw a beautiful woman who made Harry happy. They're not the ones who are racist. Sorry, Meghan, but looks like to me that your very conscious racial bias is on full display.